Hello, welcome everyone. This is Kirsty here, kicking off our live event. If you have any questions for me, please go over to the right-hand side and you click on your little comment question icon to actually open up Ask a Question, and then click Ask a Question on the bottom right-hand side. If you wish to turn on the closed captions, they're down the bottom. There's just a little CC for you to be able to get yourself started. Welcome everyone. This is Kirsty here, kicking off our live event. So then in terms of down the bottom left-hand corner, you can actually press the pause button if you need to potentially step away. And of course, your audio is in the bottom right-hand side. Our code of conduct, always try to be constructive, respectful, helpful and kind when it comes to the right-hand side and asking questions. This has been put up throughout. We just ask that, we don't actually have any harassment and we're harassment free. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which our online conferences are actually hosted today. There are traditional custodians of the land that we Australian speakers are based on, and any participants. So we would like to pay our respects to elders past, present and future. And for those that are also in New Zealand, then we have that in terms of our speakers there as well. So thank you for supporting this, Huey. So kicking off, can you actually simplify Teams adoption? There's a few different details here for you so that you can actually connect with me after the session if you need to. So who am I and why am I getting to talk about adoption? Apart from being a Microsoft MVP, which is a most valued professional, I do actually run the Australian adoption user groups. So that's for Sydney and Melbourne. You will find us online through our meetup. That's in also through Facebook as well. So either or, you can find us on Facebook or through Meetup. I'll often be pushing this information out through LinkedIn and Twitter, so you can find all of that online. One of the great things about this is we continue and go on with our adoption journey. We do talk change management and Microsoft 365, what's coming, what's new. We'll push out lots of new content wherever we actually can for you. So it's a great community of sort of change leaders out there in the industry. Do feel free to come and join us along the way. Ultimately, simplifying. Users really need to feel comfortable with change. They actually need to know what's happening and how it's going to affect their role. So change in itself is never particularly a simple thing. So when we go, can we actually simplify change? Well, when it comes to the end user, yeah, you really could. You could actually make it somewhat simple for them to go on the journey. However, it's a bit like sort of the water with the duck on it and the feeder going crazily behind. Can it be simple for a change manager? Can it be simple for the actual adoption team, the change, the senior leaders, all these sorts of things? Look, there is some work that needs to go into it. And the more work that you actually put into it, the quicker and easier it is for ultimately the users to adopt this technology. So, our journey goes through a couple of different stages and steps. Adoption success. So when we go simplifying, look, I try to keep it simple in that ultimately there's got to be a good purpose. There's the why. Then we've got to look in at, well, what's in it for me? Because ultimately, and it's not even just what's in it for me, it's what's in it for me, what's in it for us, and what's in it for them. So we've got to kind of think of a couple of different components. And that all comes back into that strategy around some of the why. From there, if we can work out what they are, if we get the why and we get in a little bit of the, what's in it for me as a part of this, then ultimately we can then kind of look at things like, well, what does it actually mean when it comes to that aha moment? Because that aha moment is really what leads to success in the long run. So that success can then make a real difference in terms of the way that we actually work and what we're going to need to focus on, because if we can align it to a particular process, then we can actually make a difference in terms of the way that we work. So then from there, we want to continuously reinforce. So adoption success is really kind of why, the what's in it for me, give them a good aha, and then continue on the journey sort of again and again and again. So if if we get in there and we start to then look at this and we drill down in a little bit more often than not, there's a lot of confusion around Teams and what is Teams? So that they kind of go, okay, so it's an app, but really it's an app that's got a little bit more to it. It's like a pane of glass that sits over the kind of the whole of Office 365, but it's not even just the whole of Office 365. It sort of sits over the pane of 365, and then it's got all these add-ins. It can be a pane literally over the whole of the internet. Plus there are apps and anything that's cloud you can kind of plug in. So it's a little bit bigger than Ben-Hur. So we want to try and simplify things for our, audience a little, because trying to get them on that journey can be, a real struggle. I've been spending a lot of time, for example, in the Microsoft Teams, Facebook for education. So I'm on that kind of group and helping them just to even, well, what is Teams? And getting in there and kind of simplifying things down a little for you. So that they often get a little bit of confusion around Teams to start with. So when I'm dealing with, and I've trained over 180,000 people, when it comes to Teams, we kind of go, okay, so if it is a pane of glass that sits over the top of Office 365, then, well, what's the focus of your company, enterprise, the not-for-profit, your school, your university, whatever it happens to be? Well, what is going to be the focus when it comes to Teams? Because ultimately what happens is we then start to kind of introduce all this tech. And all this tech that actually comes on board, we go, well, how do we start to break that down? Because it's not just about Teams, as we've said. So Teams is just kind of that one component that sits down the bottom here. So we go, okay, so Teams, but how much more in terms of the tech are you going to introduce, and how quickly do you introduce? Because when we think about Teams and trying to simplify it, are you going down the road of you just kicking off and maybe it's a unified communication? So unified communications means you're just doing the calling component, calling and chat. Now the calling and chat, we're fairly used to that. Some of us are fairly used to that because we came from a Skype for Business world. Or maybe you're doing Zoom, which is really just purely around the conferencing component, or Blue Jeans, or, there's so many different sort of communication side of things. So maybe you want to just start from a comms piece and break it down from there. Or are you starting from, we're doing a document type migration? So you got all your servers and they're all coming off, and we're thinking about SharePoint and OneDrive, and we kind of want to start with Teams because we're looking at it from a collaboration perspective. So now what we've got is we've started to introduce some more complexity because we're talking collaboration. So we've got SharePoint, we got OneDrive, we got Teams. So now we've got 3 quite big components. So often I'll get an organization go, we just want to do 1 hour of training, for example. And I kind of go, okay, well, that's 1 hour is just going to be getting you started in Teams. But we've then migrated all this documentation. They need to understand how to deal with all their documents. And I go, well, then you've got to introduce OneDrive and SharePoint. So we're taking it up a little bit higher in its complexity. Or they go, well, they really need to know how to do meetings because all our meeting functionality is coming over. And I go, well, okay, if you're introducing meetings, then you're going to be introducing something like Planner so that you've got all your tasks and actions, and you can start to be a little bit more transparent as a team. OneNote so that you can take your meeting notes, for example, and whiteboards to do your brainstorming. So here we go. We start to get a little bit more complex. So you want to try and keep it simple. Be really conscious around, well, what's in it for the user? That's that whole, what are they going to get out of it? What process are you focusing on? Are you focusing on your files? Are you focusing on your meetings? Are you focusing on your communications? So this is that strategy around why. So have a real think about that, because if you want to simplify, it starts from that first message. So yes, you can simplify it, but you've got to strategically think about how you're going to simplify it. I'm just going to bring up here the competition that's actually, there and available for this week, being week 4 in terms of, and the rules are actually there, so you can go and have a look at them. Please feel free to scan this with your mobile if you need to. Take a moment longer. You can always pause it to grab it. So just use your camera on your mobile and you'll be able to scan in that QR code so you can register as a participant in the draw. And there's some really great prizes that are actually in there for you. So when I start to talk adoption, I start to talk the journey of adoption. When we're keeping it simple, there's some components that we need to do. One, some workshopping. We've talked about the why. So all that comes as a part of the planning. I highly recommend that as part of the planning, you then kick in and you start to do some piloting. Because if you want to make it simple for your end user, you want to make sure that you've actually tested it. So there's a few things that you need to think about in terms of piloting. Do you have enough time between the pilot and the go live launch? I see more often than not, there's a 1 week jump between planning and that whole pilot. The pilot then a 1 week then from there to then going into launch, because the prep has kind of come before the pilot or as part of the pilot. Now, often we do a pilot to actually test a lot of what we're building as a part of this. So there's a couple of different components you need to think about when you go in as part of that planning, and making sure that you've got actually everything that's ready for your pilot so you can test it. Should things go wrong, you're going to need a gap, a decent gap between your pilot and launch to fix up some of the complexities that may be going wrong. And all this comes down to, lots of good governance. What's the guidance? What are the priorities? Thinking about your training, being ready and prepared, champs training, for example. We're going to go into a little bit more around the champs and sort of dive into that a little bit more. Leaderships, who are the people? How are you actually getting that, a good process that you might want to fix? Because if you can align it, it goes people first. So who are the people you want to target? What's the process that you think might actually work as a part of that pilot to get people on board so they get a bit of an aha moment, okay, to be able to then drive it out as part of the launch? Make sure that your service desk is available and ready, because if they're not ready, you're going to get a ton of phone calls that could potentially hit your service desk. And if they're not ready, then adoption becomes particularly difficult as part of that program. So then we kick in and we start to go make sure we've got websites available, and we'll deep dive into more of this. And then that follow-on support. This is kind of the journey that I would take an organization on to make sure. And, if you follow, and Microsoft have got some really great resources around adoption. And one of the beauties of that is it's got a step-by-step to try and simplify this for you to make it not so complex. When we go out there and we start to do some sort of project management around this, and we start to look at, how are you going to articulate what's going on as part of your comm so that your audience knows what's coming down the line. You can never communicate enough. The more you communicate, the easier it is to reduce down some of those barriers around change and adoption. So those workshopping, and it comes down to the same sort of stuff that I talked about in that adoption journey, you're going to see all in here. Now, I see some of the complexities comes from just purely that document migration. That can take time, and you need to give yourself some time to be prepared and have it running alongside any program when it comes to teams. I've had a lot of programs that's taken sometimes even a year to get that document migration even ready to go, depending on the complexity of an organization. So don't think that you might be able to sort of kick this off really hard and fast. However, we have seen a lot, especially recently, a lot of 2 or 3 day program rollouts with all the documents being migrated quickly, just because of the current industry challenges that we've got going on, where we need to do remote work really quickly. But sometimes that governance may not be ready to go. So communicate that. Make sure that your senior leaders and that your staff are really, one, given the permission to actually stop and learn and be ready. Make sure your senior leaders are ready to stop and learn and be ready, because the senior leadership coming on board is going to make such a difference in the long run to the way that they're actually going to engage with you. We want to make sure that they're going to be ready. So then how do we start to get to the point where you achieve potentially a 90% adoption rate, for example? And it may not be a 90% adoption rate for all of the different components, by the way. So don't ever think that you're going to get to that on everything. Now, what I want to do is I kind of want to focus on a little bit around that beginning. A lot of times we may or may not have seen this sort of that curve around adoption. So this sort of diffusion of innovations by Everett Rogers, an important component to kind of look at. Now, those early innovators, more often than not, what I will see is when we mention Office 365 or Teams, you may get people that immediately throw their hands in the air and say, I would really like to learn and be ready. Or they just get started. They know how to log into Office 365. You might go, we've got Office 365, we're ready, and we will roll it out soon. Go and have a look at some of the reporting. Go and see who's already gone and logged in. Go and see who's using it. You may be able to use them as your change champs, for example. Get them prepared and ready. Reach out to them should you need to. If we can get to the point where we get that early majority, which is kind of, they'll get in the change champions, you start to get the change champions take on those that are around them, we flow into then the late majority. Now, the late majority, you're going to work a little bit harder to try and get them on board. They're going to need some real hand-holding, training, some support, some online. Now, the laggards, sometimes we may not even get the laggards on board. And I'm not going to waste a lot of energy on the laggards. I am going to, more often than not, see a lot of times that the pressure of the majority will push the laggards on the journey. If they're not coming on the journey, then what is it that you've got around KPIs in the business to be able to support? One, do they know the tech? Do they need the tech even? Sometimes they may not even need it. Okay, so you're not ever going to get 90% because maybe not everyone is going to need it. So what is a reasonable statistic for your business? So, without some of the change, there's no innovation, creativity, incentive for improvement. So what we want to do is have a look at how change gives us that opportunity to be able to manage the business, to be innovative, look at process, open up some of the tech. The more we shut things down, it's very hard for people to be innovative. We want them to be persistent. We want them to be curious. And, the culture can make a really big difference to an adoption rate and whether it's going to be simple or not. So some of the benefits, more often than not, I try and lead with when we're doing comms or we're doing training or we're trying to get them on the journey. There's a lot of really great benefits that comes with teams, and they need to be articulated because we want to get people excited by a new way of moving forward in terms of making adoption simple. Now, there's a lot of really great research out there. The fact that there's sort of 4 hours potentially a week in saved collaboration and information sharing, being able to find information really quickly and easily. The decision making increased. Give them stories, good stories. If you can get stories internally, of course, they're always going to resonate much quicker and easier than if they're sometimes those external stories. So as part of your pilot, look at the case studies. Look at what your base measurements are so that you can actually come back and measure it and then prove that you managed to shift something around a business decision. You've managed to increase. Maybe it was even something like, for example, it was a program of work and you were out there and it was a proposal and you were able to put it out so much faster, for example, and you saved a lot of time. So these are all components. Now, there's a whole heap in terms of benefits that came out of the Forrester report. These are just some of them. I pick and choose depending on the audience that I've got in front of me, because a frontline worker is not going to be as interested in some components compared to another component, for example. So choose wisely over a benefit and then kind of hammer that home with some of the stories. Now that aligns to, of course, what are the persona that you're going to be working with, what's the process you're going to change and making sure it's relevant. This is how we kind of simplify. Because if we do the work up front and we get the right scenario and we know who that we're targeting and that we've got some good measurement around it, we can then start to prove that the journey that we're actually on is going to benefit that particular audience that you've got in front of you. Sometimes you can come up with some really good sort of generic ones. And there are some great generic ones that are actually out there in the Fast Track Productivity Library. So in that library, there is then lots of different scenarios that are focused on the different personas within the business to be able to support you to go, well, what could we focus on and what could we measure? And what would it mean, say, for the finance team? How could we do this and do it well? And pitch it in to get good adoption. So one of the sort of a sales team scenario, to give you a bit of an example of, this was something that, we'll often work with. So if I'm going to do a workshop right at the very beginning, because if I workshop, and sometimes I can do really simple adoption programs and there'll be 5 days, I do a workshop, I work out the team, what is it that they want to get out of something like Teams. And for these guys, they just wanted a single version of a go-to-market or a brief proposal that all the others could actually access and edit rather than emailing around different versions. They wanted to use Teams so that had a single place to go and be able to co-author, and they'll know it's successful when they were having quick conversations. They were kind of meeting the client needs really fast. The proposal was pushed out. They had more time to then close a deal. So they then saw, and at the end of this, it was also we want to increase our sales by this percentage. So if you can actually give a really good measure around it, that percentage of it might have been for a really big organization that's doing, multi-millions in sales. You go, we want to do a 2% shift. That could be some really big money to go, and this is how we're going to do it, and show them how to get better commission, because they were sales individuals. They were very focused on commission. Important components. So then that behavior, what exhibits success for your business? That curiosity, it's the sales measurement, it's the how to do it. So they're all important components that I would say with a business. Make sure you understand what behavior you need for success as a culture. Now, teams, more often than not, they'll go out, you'll create a ton of different teams. You'll get it all structured. You start to have a look at, what do we actually need around sort of governance, the building, and they're all important components, absolutely. But if someone is really new to teams, how many do you really want to have before they start to feel overwhelmed? So we kind of go, well, let's try and keep it simple to start with. And when we're looking at what makes a really good team, when you look at the research out there, no more than, ultimately kind of the sweet spot is around about 6 people makes a really good team. And everyone kind of understands, what is their value as a part of a team. So when we start to get to more and more people, then you can get a lot more crowding. So what do you need? What is also the focus of a team that you're going to create? So always a really good component. So that comes down to some of that governance and some of the structure and the things that you actually need to do when you create it. Now, there are a lot of other topics that are being run. Lorian's great at being able to talk around governance, and go back and have a look at some of the recordings that might be there as part of M365 May to be able to understand more around governance. Now, I'm not going to focus on that. More often than not, though, what I would do is I'd have a look at some of the potential structure. And I would go, well, what does it look like? What do you need? How are you going to make it easy? How are you going to support your business? Something as simple as pressing your Windows key and your period, which is your full stop button, Windows period, can actually give you the Windows icons. Now, the reason I say that in terms of some of the structure, if you've got accessibility issues within the business, around maybe it's dyslexia, for example, or it could just be general. When you think about it, you'll always be able to easily see a picture over the word. So try and make it a little bit easier for adoption to go, I know exactly what that particular channel is for inside a team. Now, the governance can make a big difference around adoption, because where there's lots of things turned off, people then may not actually take it up, and you start to get shadow IT. So you want to simplify adoption, then be really careful around what you need as part of that governance and some of the guidance for your team. So when we're talking then teams, help them to really be careful and communicate what it is that you want them to do in there. And there are a lot of different components to get you started. Communication, your collaboration component, and how to actually do that. Are you going to get in and get involved into the store and bots and, all those third-party applications and plugging in? Now, adoption can really kick off when you start to bring the technology in that they're using in other windows into one place to be. Because when we talk about that pane of glass, then it can make it that little bit easier, because when they've got one place to be, you can increase adoption of teams. So that extension can make a real difference. If it's a marketing team, for example, maybe they need to have in things like, their Twitter dropped in so they can keep an eye out on it. Their Facebook accounts dropped in so they can keep an eye out on it. The news, and it's got some kind of a search component to go anytime our name gets mentioned, it actually comes up, some kind of extension piece there. And the great part is they can then work with confidence, because it does have that security around it to be able to give them a sense of being safe. Now, it's a good idea to tell your users, we wouldn't go to this unless we felt it was actually secure, and take them on that journey so they understand. Now, cloud in itself can be a complexity when it comes to adoption, because a lot of times people don't understand even what the cloud is. So to start from sometimes that basic. If they've never dealt with Office 365 and you're going straight to Teams, you're going to need to get a cloud message in there and get them to feel comfortable with moving to the cloud. So let's have a look at the training component. Now, when I see a lot of team training done, it's very generic, it's seminar, it's sort of thrown out there for everyone. I always say try and train by the team. When we talk about good team collaboration and communication, that team could come in many forms, by the way. It could be you're focusing on a business process. It could be the line of business. So what is the team and how are you going to train it? How does it get broken up? It could be the process that you're focused on, for example. But if I'm going to train and I want to do good team collaboration and communication, I'd want to make sure that I get all the people in the room that are going to work together. So senior leadership, bring, for example, that wider senior leadership team together so that I know that they first even know how to do it. But they're not the only ones that are going to drive forward good adoption. Your team as a whole will need to come together and work out what their best way is of moving forward. Now, often I kind of even don't call it training anymore. I go, we're going to get together and we're going to workshop a new way of working when it comes to collaboration, communication as a team. And I might spend a half day, and instead of going, we're spending 2.5 or 3 hours doing training, I go, we're going to spend 2.5 or 3 hours workshopping. We get a bit of a different mindset of when they come in. And then we can go, there's ongoing training on different components. So I start from a bit of a different perspective when it comes to adoption. More often than not, what I would do is I would actually have in my teams, I'd have something around a what's new program or a learning or for your change champs, different components that I find would really help and support. Microsoft have got a really great plugin that is your learning pathways. It's a SharePoint site, and I have that SharePoint site plugged in Teams for, say, my change champ. So it gives the learning pathways, and you can have all the recommended, training, and it can be customized to whatever it is that you actually need on that SharePoint. And then I just plug that in. A couple of other core components that I might plug in for my champs, for example, to support them, and or some learning or a what's new channel. And there's lots of different reasons you might create, for your team, different ways to work. You might have the Microsoft Teams blog that's actually there from the tech community, and it will talk about different features and what's new, learning, for example. The Teams demo is a really awesome one, a great way to get started and learning how to use Teams. Then there's the Office 365 videos for Microsoft 365 to be able to support them on that journey. So when we go in and we start to then have a look at that, for example, then we can, support them because there's lots of really great, video production and functionality there to be able to work. So getting interactive with teams, communicating can be really important. What is it for? Why are you there? Why do we need it? How do you work with anyone? Look, if you're looking at being on the go, then show them how to work from a mobile phone, not just from a desktop. Connect up a mobile. Actually support them with that. What does it mean to have a single source of truth around documents? So have some good communication, some design around it. When you're talking about the business rules and a little bit of guidance, get them to understand the difference between the me and the we when it comes to files and how it all plugs into Teams in terms of getting your work done. Where do they go to find information still? And if you've got some compliance type thing, there's EDMS or you've got protected documents of some kind, then what is it for each one of those? Where do we go? We see a lot of confusion around that. If you can simplify that, then you'll find that the messaging and the adoption will actually lift. Lauren and Susan Henley, came up with that collaboration contract, and there's also communication contracts as well that you'll find out there. As a team, what will you do? Workshop it as a part of it to make sure that you all agree and you actually come back. I would highly recommend going and have a look at that. Now, if you're going to start introducing something like bots, it can increase adoption, but can also really confuse when it comes to adoption. Right, so there's a two-edged sword. Over time, bots will definitely increase. To introduce them right at the word go, you're going to confuse people. It's going to get really, hard to kick off really fast. There are some great bots out there. Get started. It could just even be something like Hipmunk, for example, where it's just how do you quickly and simply find a flight. Getting your change champions up and running. With a change champ, important to get out there and actually ask. Don't necessarily nominate, because when we start to nominate, we haven't necessarily brought them on board. They need to be tech enthusiasts. They need to be out there and be able to support. They're the go-tos. They're the ones that others will naturally walk up to. They also need to be supported along that journey with rewards and recognitions. You can have those teams to be able to support them. They need to have time to get across the whole of Office 365 so that when someone walks up to them, they can actually ask questions. So they need a lot more in-depth training than your average user would. Doing seminars, give them good hand holding. So then when we look at it, thanking them and supporting them, Teams, Yammer posts, for example, congratulate them. Make sure that they're well known. What does that look like? Do you put information around them maybe it's emails that go out, different posts. Maybe you put a poster up in your kitchens, for example. These are all core components to be able to support when it comes to your champions and your community, because it's not much use having champions if your community don't know who they are, and it's not much use having a change champion that your community don't naturally want to go and step up to and go, how do you do this? They're the people beside them that they will naturally gravitate to, the ones that kind of go yes, for example. So then simplifying, yes, you can actually simplify. One, have a clear goal and vision and not just about IT. Because if you're just going to talk about IT and go, we're doing this because we've got to get off the service, that's not going to get your adoption. So have really good, sensible setup. Make sure you got that leadership buy-in. Always communicate. Now, you can never communicate enough around what's coming, and be inventive around your communication too, wherever you can. Because I've seen some really great little packs that are going out. Could be gamification with cards. It could be, lots of different types of ways that you can bring in good communication. The workshopping and the contracts that you might do, and have good ongoing training. Look, we saw that in the Teams with those plugins, because it doesn't stop. Not only that, but Teams and Microsoft 365 every single month have such a plethora of new features coming through. And if you look at the roadmap, it's constant. So how does your user get across some of the new features that they might actually need to be a part of? And then that champion network. So as a change specialist, and for those that are, on the project side, simplification, look, there is the methodology there for you to be able to follow. And Microsoft focus on the ProSci methodology to be able to get you where you want to go. And we'll talk more about that when we get into, the session that we've got at the end of the month around Office 365 and adoption. So all that methodology is actually there. You can go through the simple process. There is all of the content there for you to be able to go through. When it comes to Office 365, the power lies with the individual and the work. It's not about the technology. Teams is just one of, a few different techs that's out there that you could potentially use. However, the great part comes from, one, your enthusiasm, two, the security, the technology that is actually there, but it's the people and the process that you put in place to drive forward. So those resources, those step-by-steps are there to simplify it. And if you get that right, it becomes really easy for the user to go on the journey. It then can be a simple adoption journey. So go and have a look at the success with team information. Microsoft have also got their fast track as well, which has got a ton of ways to be able to drive business value. There's blogs out there. There's the Change Champion network that's, Microsoft actually provide as part of the tech community to be able to support you, and you can join in the monthly calls. It's all out there for you to be able to work with to make sure that you can simplify that journey. So then, lifting the adoption and the journeys and the pitfalls. I've actually got a lot of sort of stories, I suppose, from having done well over 60. I should probably a lot more than that. I've been saying that now for a couple of years. So when it comes to those adoption stories, I'm going to talk about, how other customers and clients and people out in the field have actually done this. What does it actually look like as a part of the journey? Some of the support and making sure that you can get, that starting point. What are the things that you can actually do? So that's coming up very soon. So my contact details, here they all are. Don't forget that, I would like to thank the sponsors, and I will come in now and we will actually have a look at any questions that you've actually got that I can help and support you with. So we've now got about 4 or 5 minutes to be able to answer some of those questions. Feel free to put them into chat. Happy to answer any questions if you have them. How many channels is too many channels? Look, that's always a challenging one, and it comes up fairly regularly because, one of the things that actually comes from having a ton of channels, you can have as many channels as you need. However, do you have the notifications set for all of them? Which ones are you focused on? Which ones do you hide? And we find that, and a really great research that's actually out there, Swoop's actually had a look at this, and they've got a white paper that's recently come out in terms of, the channels, how many do we actually focus on is probably a better question rather than, how many should we have? Now, that comes down to, some of the processes. Personally, I have hundreds. How many do I spend my time in? Probably around about 20 I truly focus on. Just get those notifications correct. If there aren't any other questions, I will finish up for the session. Thank you very much for joining, and I look forward to seeing anyone if they'd like to join at the end of the month on the 29th. I will be closing out just before the final key lock note, I should say. Feel free to join us then. Thank you everyone for coming along today.